Hi friends, host Eric here, host Talking with Famous People. This is a car video. I'm driving on the highway right now, so there's probably a bit of background noise. I'll try to speak loudly so that it's easy enough to hear me. I know my phone doesn't record as loudly as I would like it to, and additionally, I have a lavalier mic that I need to start using when I'm making videos on the phone to improve the audio quality that Cameron gave me, but I haven't started using it yet. With that unnecessary preface out of the way, let me say, if I haven't already, that I'm host Eric. Welcome to Talking to Famous People, and I'm driving to Oakland to get mushrooms right now. I got an hour and a half or so until I get there, and I've been going for about an hour and a half so far. I mention this because during that first hour and a half, I was listening to music, but I was mostly also thinking about cognitive function stuff, and the large question that's occupying a lot of my attention right now, which is, how can I more effectively communicate about this subject such that people benefit from the truth that I'm speaking about it. So, first of all, let's sort of lay out a scope. Let's sort of lay out the problem, right? The problem is I'm making claims that I have an exclusively defensible understanding of typology. And it's very difficult for me to exclude myself from making these sort of claims, because whenever anybody's trying to explain something, like let's say you're trying to explain the concept of multiplication to a child. They've already learned addition, they've already learned subtraction, now you're going to try to explain to them what multiplication is, conceptually. They're going to say, well, so if we have 5 plus 5, we have 2 5s. But if we have 5 times 5, we have 5 5s. That would be not really explaining it conceptually, but it would be giving an example that demonstrates a distinction. Namely, that plus says each of the things on either side of this plus symbol is a single unit. Each of the things on either side of this plus symbol should be treated as a pile divided into two portions, not necessarily equal. Right? So like 3 plus 5 equals 8. Well, the things on either side of the plus symbol represent 8 divided into 2 piles. One pile of 3 and one pile of 5. So when you're explaining things like multiplication or division, you're going to be referencing previous concepts like addition and subtraction, right? You're going to be explaining that multiplication is what it is and how it's distinct from addition and subtraction. Whereas in addition, you view the things on either side of the plus as piles that you're combining together. With multiplication, you're treating one side of the pile, really both, but functionally you're treating one side of the pile as a pile, and the other side as a quantity of piles, right? And it turns out that it doesn't matter which side you treat as the pile and which side you treat as the quantity of piles, you'll get the same answer either way. So 7 times 5 is the same as 5 times 7. Okay, so this is explaining multiplication, right? Its explanation requires conceptual work be done narratively, but it also requires that you have some examples to illustrate if you're going to fully explain it. Now, let's say instead of explaining multiplication to children, I was talking to adults about explaining multiplication to children. And I said, 5 times 3 is 8. Someone would say, I'm sorry, but 5 times 3 is 15. And I go, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant 5 plus 3 is 8. Because everybody I'm talking to about explaining multiplication already understands it. And I'm not explaining multiplication to them. I'm talking about how to explain multiplication to children. So, in such a situation, others are able to validate for themselves that I'm not spewing bullshit, right? Because when I do spew bullshit, they can easily catch it, and everyone in the room's in agreement. 5 times 3 is not 8. 5 times 3 is 15. So, because they can validate that I understand multiplication themselves just by catching me making mistakes or asking me a couple of questions or any number of other approaches that they might use to see if I really know how to multiply, then when I'm explaining how I explain to other people how to multiply, people are perfectly content to respect that explanation. Well, he does know how to multiply. He's a teacher. He's going to explain to us how he explains to other people multiplication. He's not even trying to say anything like that's the best way to explain multiplication. He's just explaining how he does it. And the thing being explained isn't in any dispute. Multiplication. With cognitive functions, the challenge I have is that people are fine with that multiplication situation. If instead I come in and say, I want to talk to you about collision. Collision is a new function in math that I've made up, and how these old functions in math are wrong, blah, 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 blah. Well, people are going to be, needless to say, very skeptical because there's such broad consensus about math and multiplication and stuff. Things trickle down from the top. Some mathematician may generate some new function and a symbol that represents it accordingly, and if in fact it's mathematically validated, which is to say the function actually expresses a relationship between objects on either side of the function that's unique, new, and productive mathematically, then it will enter into the language of math at some point, right? But there'd be no possibility of me trying to explain that new function to anybody but other mathematicians in math journals or whatever. With cognitive functions, we've got a really tricky situation. We've got a genius named Carl Jung who grokked the general concept of personality type correctly-ish, but who did not delineate it he did not delineate the distinctions implicit to it adequately, and where he attempted to make those kind of distinctions, he was often wrong. And the reason is because he was medium bad at both deliberation functions and ultra good at one and ultra unconscious at the other, but adequate at it with the knowledge functions. So, in other words, he had TI as an absolute value. Carl Jung was an INFJ, but his epistemology was no first. And when you can also validate on deliberation, hooray, but when you can't, trust the knowledge. You're an NIDOM, and he did trust his knowledge, and he should have, because it was a breakthrough genius concept, idea, recognition of a pattern that he was seeing, and he gave it enough form that he allowed future generations to hammer out the details, right? But we have the situation where, because of the fact that it wasn't initially presented correctly, it was presented as well as he could present it, and we shouldn't condemn him for not doing the next generation's work as well, you know. But because it wasn't presented as a defensible case initially, and then because future incarnations of the idea or future interpretations of the idea were either expressly not intended to adequately explain things, but rather to be used for some other purpose, like MBTI, or attempted to adequately explain things, but failed to because they didn't know how to explain things well, like socionics. You also then have the woohoo shit, where, you know, like human design or whatever, where they think that nothing ever gets conscribed by its identity, you know, and you can just continually add more nonsense into things and have some sort of meaningful discourse, which isn't the case at all, right? So I'm making a unique kind of claim here. I'm saying we have the Rosetta Stone for human consciousness and reality itself. We've had it for a while, but it's understandable why none of us have understood it as such, because it had been mistranslated by multiple parties so much that nobody any longer believed it had a single accurate translation. It does, and I'm claiming I and talking with famous people in this process across YouTube are responsible for the correct translation of it. At least the parts that we've translated so far are translated correctly. So, and that translation is exclusively correct of alternatives, right? That claim is, it has no audience. And the reason it has no audience is because for people who are willing to be receiver deliberator types, that is to say, to listen and hear what other people have to say and determine if it's correct, well, they're going to be naturally incredulous about the idea that with these myriad different interpretations, where each of the parties is saying more or less or behaving as though theirs is correct, that only a single one of them actually is. You've got infinite possible interpretations of astrology. None of them is correct, because astrology is not an actual model of anything that is defensible, right? And typology looks like that. It looks like one of those arbitrary, infinitely regressive things, because there are so many different interpretations of it, and people use the concepts willy-nilly to construct self-concept narratives, and feel as though they understand why they are how they are, I guess, but it's the point is, if they're not understanding it correctly, it's only serving their subjective epistemological concerns, and it's not allowing humanity as a whole to evolve metaphysically, you know. So my challenge, as I've said before, is to figure out a way to communicate adequately the truth of a message that is going to piss a lot of people off inherently, which is that I actually know most other people that I encounter. If I spend time to determine their type, I will know more about them than they actually know about themselves. Now, this is something that certain personality types are going to be very offended by the very concept of it. That how could you possibly know me better than I know myself? I have all my own particular experience. But we can see that it's true when you're encountering people like Melissa Talks and Club ENTP, neither of whom are actually ENTPs, and who wholeheartedly apparently believe they are. So they're either not understanding themselves, or they're not understanding what rationality is versus, say, subjective metrics, or there's some disconnect there, right? So that's what I mean when I say I can understand people better than they understand themselves because they understand cognitive functions. It's a consequence of a confluence of multiple things. Like it is the case because, one, I'm among a very, very few people around talking to famous people who actually understands cognitive functions correctly. The rest of the internet is just wildly, or less wildly, but in either case, off base and doing more harm than good with their incorrect interpretations of a correct idea. So I understand, when I say I understand people better than they understand themselves, I mean, one can understand people better than they understand themselves if one has equipped this piece of gear called cognitive function, correct cognitive function analysis protocol. And it's not me that is important in the equation. The fact that I can understand people better than they understand themselves is true, but is non-unique to me. Except it is kind of unique to me right now because the actual reality of typology, the significance of it, the fact that it is truly actually defensible, that we can gather empirics to support all this shit, that eventually they'll be able to find some other kinds of physical tests that'll be able to determine, like nobody disputes that they're blood types, right? And nobody says, you don't know me, my blood I can take any kind of blood in a transfusion. You don't tell me what my blood is. It's not O, it's whatever it wants to be. Nobody says that, right? Well, the problem is, metaphysicalities are it's more challenging for people to understand the actuality of metaphysicalities than it is for people to understand the actuality of physicalities. What I mean by actuality is the reason Club ENTP or Melissa Talks, either one of them, the reason they think they're ENTPs even though they're not is explained by cognitive functions. So because they have those subjective epistemology functions as tool functions. Melissa Talks, I think it's SI. Club ENTP is definitely FI tool, right? I'm very certain of that. I've never had an opportunity to type the guy properly, right? So in order to have that opportunity, he'd need to come in and be genuinely interested in being typed correctly, rather than interested in undermining my ability to type it correctly. I'm not I don't want to play that game, you know. It's not fun for me at all to try to push through this person's wrong self-narratives. And it's embarrassing. Like, I feel cringy about it because obviously I'm seeing through shit, but other people don't necessarily know that I'm seeing through it, right? So anyway, the point is, I've never really had the chance to type him properly. For him to allow himself to be fully assessed without trying to control the process himself is a necessary precondition for me to have formally typed him. But I can pretty definitively say he's T.I. Polar. The moment I know he's T.I. Polar is what happened in that last video that he made where he talked about the definitions of dumb. So I called him dumb. I insulted him. He didn't like that. It made him feel bad, or it triggered him or something. So, but he's still trying to prove that he's an ENTP. And so instead of saying, I don't like that, that triggers me, he said, I'm an ENTP, so I'm going to prove that Eric's lying about me by using definitions. And he defined dumb with three different definitions, all of which linked to the blind, deaf, and dumb, meaning mute, right? Obviously, I didn't use the word like that, and he doesn't understand that you don't get to dictate to the other person how they're defining the term, right? And think you've done any kind of work. He certainly didn't prove I was lying. Insulting him is insulting him. It's not telling the truth or lying. But certainly, he has to know that I didn't mean, one would assume, he has to know that I didn't mean he was mute. But he doesn't understand that him choosing to use those definitions of dumb equals mute, and establishing that those definitions are out there, and that if we use those definitions, my statement is false because he's not mute. To think that somehow that proves that I've been lying about him is as definitive an example as you can get of T.I. Polar. That's why it's the place of least resistance. You understand it so poorly that you do things like that. And yet it's important to you. It's important to him that he be treated fairly, and he doesn't feel as though I'm treating him fairly. Because after all, he's just as creative and smart and blah, blah, blah as I am, so why doesn't he get to be an ENTP too? Well, because it doesn't... because yada, 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 right? So, the thing is, it's indicative as well of a backwards relationship with labels that makes it very challenging for me to effectively communicate about this subject. People want to be, in general, labeled with the labels they want. I'm gorgeous, I'm incredibly athletic, I'm brilliant, I have high dexterity, high charisma, high strength, high wisdom, high intelligence, and I'm just bee's knees. That's what people want to be told. And additionally, there's a fairly important reality behind that, which is people spend so much time telling each other what's wrong with each other in a horrible fashion that it's reasonable to conclude that positive people are better, right? That if I'm telling you, you can do whatever you want, don't be held back, then I'm not being one of those awful people who's trying to, shut you down. But the problem is, it's because we've failed to use cognitive functions as a frame of reference, and thus have defined people as having infinite potential, and defined describing limitations as somehow being oppressive. It almost always is, so that's why we've done this, but when we do it with cognitive functions, it's not, because it's always a trade-off. Let me see, I gotta stop this now. I'll make another video.